The penthouse suite of the Grand Elysium offered a flawless, sweeping view of the Chicago skyline, a testament to Vikram Patel's meticulously rebuilt empire. Yet his gaze remained fixed on the security monitor, watching the rhythmic, humiliating swipe of a mop pushed by a woman whose wedding ring he used to wear. Some betrayals don't end with a signed divorce paper. They fester in the quiet, vindictive spaces of the aftermath. If these fragile, dangerous intersections of past and present resonate with you, stay with me. There are far more secrets hidden behind these closed hotel doors. Keep listening if you want to uncover them. The penthouse of the Grand Elysium Hotel was a sanctuary of silence, suspended 40 stories above the electric hum of Chicago. Vikram Patel stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights painting geometric shadows across the sharp angles of his face. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch, the ice having melted long ago. But his attention was not on the million-dollar view he had spent the last 5 years bleeding to attain. It was fixed on the bank of security monitors glowing faintly in the corner of his private office. Screen 4. The second-floor lobby concourse. It was 2:14 a.m. The grand chandeliers were dimmed to a soft amber glow, casting long reflections against the newly polished Italian marble. At the center of the frame was a woman pushing an industrial mop. She wore a shapeless gray uniform, her dark hair pulled back into an untidy frayed knot, her shoulders hunched with a fatigue that seemed to seep deeper than the physical labor. Zara. Vikram exhaled the sound barely a whisper against the quiet hum of the climate control. He didn't blink. He watched the repetitive rhythmic swing of her arms. Left, right, step back, wring out the mop, repeat. There was a time half a decade ago when those hands were adorned with a 2-carat diamond and a platinum band he had spent 2 years of his early career saving for. He remembered the way her fingers used to trace the rim of her wine glass during dinner parties in their pristine suburban kitchen. He also remembered the way those same fingers had tangled in Tyler Black's hair on a Tuesday afternoon, captured in the agonizingly clear footage from the doorbell camera he was never supposed to check. Vikram had not screamed that night. He had not broken plates, nor had he confronted her. He had simply packed a single duffel bag, left his wedding ring on the granite island, and vanished. He ghosted his own life. Now she was here, scrubbing his floors. Down on the second floor, Zara Ahmed paused, leaning heavily against the yellow plastic bucket. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. The harsh scent of industrial lemon bleach burned her nostrils, a stark contrast to the Le Labo perfumes she used to layer on her skin. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of a calloused hand. She didn't know who owned the Grand Elysium. To her, it was simply the only place that hadn't run a deep background check into her ruined credit score and the chaotic public bankruptcy proceedings tied to Tyler's tech collapse. She just needed the $16 an hour. She needed to pay the rent for her cramped, windowless studio in Pilsen. Staring down at the wet marble, Zara caught a blurry reflection of herself. She looked away quickly, unable to stomach the hollowed-out eyes staring back. The guilt was a heavy, physical weight in her chest, a permanent resident since the day she walked into her beautiful home to find it empty, a single ring resting on the counter. She had traded a quiet, devoted love for a spectacular, devastating illusion. And this endless, solitary night shift was the penance. Up in the penthouse, Vikram took a slow sip of the watered-down scotch. He tasted ash. The victory of seeing her reduced to a nameless phantom in his empire, was supposed to feel like vindication. It was supposed to be the final stitch closing the wound. Instead, as he watched her wince and readjust her grip on the mop, his chest tightened. The ghost he had tried to leave behind in the suburbs had followed him into his fortress. And the quiet, terrifying truth settled over him. Watching her bleed wasn't going to heal him. The service elevators of the Grand Elysium smelled of ozone industrial starch and the faint metallic scent of damp linens. Zara leaned the side of her head against the cool aluminum wall, closing her eyes as the car descended. Every muscle in her back felt as though it had been pulled taut over a rusting frame. She had 20 minutes left on her shift. When the doors slid open with a soft chime at the basement level, Phil Gardner was waiting. Phil was a man whose entire existence seemed defined by the clipboard he carried and the dark circles under his eyes. As the night operations manager, he was the boss of the subterranean corridors. Ahmed, Phil said, his voice a flat, bureaucratic drone. Change of plans. Someone spilled a tray of espressos in the third-floor mezzanine lounge. The morning crew won't have time to deep extract before the early check-ins. I need you to handle it." Zara's grip tightened on the handle of her cart. The mezzanine was notoriously massive, lined with plush, cream-colored wool carpets that required heavy machinery to clean. It was explicitly a two-person job. "Mr. Gardner, my shift ends in 15 minutes. Zara said, her voice quiet but steady. Phil didn't look up from his clipboard. "Overtime is approved unless you don't want the hours. I can always find someone else who needs the extra wages." The threat was thinly veiled, a delicate needle pressed against the bubble of her fragile survival. Zara swallowed the sharp metallic taste of pride rising in the back of her throat. She thought of the red final notice, slipped under the door of her Pilsen apartment yesterday morning. "I'll get the extractor," she murmured, lowering her gaze. As she dragged the heavy water-filled machine toward the freight elevator, the physical strain forced a bitter memory to the surface. She remembered Tyler Black standing on the balcony of a rented penthouse in Miami, the ocean breeze ruffling his perfectly styled hair. He had handed her a glass of vintage champagne, his smile blinding and full of absolute certainty. "We're building an Empire Z. You'll never have to worry about a price tag again." It was a beautiful, catastrophic lie. Tyler's wealth had been a house of cards built on misappropriated investor funds and predatory loans. When the feds raided their home, Tyler had immediately tried to throw her under the bus to save himself. The champagne, the silk dresses, the illusion of safety, all of it had evaporated, leaving her with nothing but legal fees and a hollowed-out soul. 5 floors above the mezzanine, in the quiet solitude of his office, Vikram reviewed the digital logs on his tablet. The system tracked the movement of every keycard, every piece of heavy equipment. He watched the icon representing the carpet extractor moving across the third-floor blueprint. Phil had executed the order perfectly. Vikram had sent a brief encrypted email at 4 a.m. increased maintenance load on the second-floor janitorial staff. Test efficiency. Phil didn't know he was targeting one specific woman. He just followed the directives of the man who signed his paychecks. Vikram set the tablet face down on the mahogany desk. He rubbed his temples, the faint beginnings of a migraine pulsing behind his eyes. He had expected to feel a surge of vindication, a grim satisfaction at seeing the woman who shattered his life reduced to taking orders and cleaning up other people's messes. Instead, the silence of the office felt suffocating. He picked up his crystal tumbler, rolling the last drop of amber liquid around the base. He was pulling the strings from the dark, orchestrating the slow torture of a ghost. But as the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, Vikram realized the bitter truth. The puppeteer was just as trapped in the dark as the marionette. The third-floor service corridor was a narrow utilitarian artery hidden behind the opulent walls of the guest areas. Stripped of marble and silk, it offered only exposed pipes, the relentless hum of industrial ice machines and flickering fluorescent lights. Zara was dragging the heavy carpet extractor back toward the supply closet, her muscles trembling from the extended shift. It was 4:15 a.m. The hotel was holding its breath before the dawn. The wheels of the heavy machine caught on a slight unevenness in the concrete floor, jarring her shoulders. Zara let out a soft, frustrated breath, bending down to wrench the wheel free. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. They were not the heavy rubber-soled thuds of maintenance staff, nor the hurried clicks of the night audit team. These steps were measured, authoritative, and struck the concrete with the sharp resonance of leather on stone. Zara instinctively pulled the bulky extractor closer to the wall, shrinking herself to allow whoever it was to pass. The cardinal rule of the night shift was invisibility. She kept her eyes firmly on the scuffed toe of her work boots as the figure approached. But before the person even entered her peripheral vision, a scent drifted through the stale, bleach-heavy air. Cedarwood, vetiver, a faint trace of expensive wool. Zara's breath hitched in her throat. The scent was a ghost, a visceral trigger that bypassed her logic and slammed directly into her chest. It was the smell of Sunday mornings in a sunlit kitchen. It was the scent left on the pillowcase the morning she woke up to an empty house. Her gaze traveled upward against her will. Past the handmade Italian leather Oxfords, past the impeccably tailored charcoal trousers, up to the face she had convinced herself she would never see again. Vikram. He stopped. They were barely 3 feet apart in the claustrophobic hallway. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to snap out of its axis. Zara's hands went numb, slipping from the plastic handle of the extractor. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened her mouth at the name Vic forming on her tongue, but her vocal cords were paralyzed. He looked older. The soft, easygoing lines around his eyes that she used to trace with her fingertips were gone, replaced by hard, unforgiving angles. Vikram stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locked onto hers. Zara braced herself for the explosion. She waited for the disgust, the righteous anger, the venomous words she had earned 1,000 times over. She deserved his rage. She had craved his anger 5 years ago, begging for a fight instead of the agonizing silence he had left her with. But the explosion never came. Vikram's expression remained entirely blank. The eyes that had once looked at her with absolute adoration now held nothing but a freezing, abyssal void. He looked at her not as a woman who had shattered his soul, nor even as an enemy. He looked at her as if she were a smudge on the concrete. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Zara felt the blood drain from her face, the raw shame burning hotter than any spoken insult could. Without a single word, without a change in his breathing, Vikram broke the eye contact. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, stepped smoothly around the bulky cleaning cart, and continued down the hallway. His measured footsteps faded into the ambient hum of the ice machines. Zara collapsed against the cold cinder block, while her hands shaking violently. He hadn't spoken, but the message was deafeningly clear. He was here, and she was absolutely nothing to him. The deadbolt of the Pilsen studio apartment slid into place with a hollow metallic clank. Zara didn't bother turning on the overhead light. She sank to the scuffed linoleum floor, her back against the door, and pulled her knees to her chest. The silence of the cramped, windowless room pressed inward, heavy and unforgiving. Her mind, however, was a deafening roar of the past. The hallway encounter had torn open a locked vault in her memory. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images played relentlessly. She remembered the suffocating, toxic thrill of the affair with Tyler, the clandestine afternoons in upscale hotel rooms that smelled of expensive champagne and borrowed time. Tyler had been a hurricane, all charm and breathless urgency, making her feel dangerously alive. But the high always crashed the moment she drove her SUV back into her quiet suburban driveway. She remembered the agonizing showers she took before Vikram came home from the firm, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, desperately trying to wash away Tyler's scent and the crushing weight of her own duplicity. Vikram had been a steady harbor kind, reliable, deeply devoted. She had repaid his quiet loyalty by setting fire to their foundation. The memory that gutted her the most wasn't the affair itself, but the night the hurricane finally ripped her house apart. There was no screaming match, no shattered glass, just the pristine silence of an empty home. Vikram's closet completely bare, and his wedding band sitting dead center on the kitchen island. That silence had been her sentence. Tonight in the service corridor, he had delivered the execution. Miles away, high above the sleeping city, Vikram stood under the scalding spray of his master bathroom's rainfall shower. The water beat against his shoulders, turning the glass enclosure into an opaque wall of steam. He leaned his forearms against the dark slate tile, bowing his head. His heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm that felt entirely foreign. He had spent the last 50 years convincing himself that he had excised Zara from his soul like a malignant tumor. He had built the Grand Elysium not just as a business, but as a monument to his resurrection. When he had first seen her name flag in the payroll system a month ago, a cold, dark thrill had coursed through his veins. Let her scrub the floors of his empire. Let her feel the absolute bottom of the pit she had dug for herself. But seeing her in the flesh, pinned against the cinder block wall, like a frightened animal, had unraveled the narrative he had carefully constructed. Her eyes had been hollowed out, stripped of the vibrant, haughty spark he once loved and later despised. She looked utterly destroyed. Vikram turned off the water. The sudden quiet of the bathroom felt heavy. He grabbed a towel, catching a glimpse of his reflection in the fogged mirror. He had wanted her to bleed. He had wanted to be the untouchable god looking down at her ruin. Yet as he wiped the condensation from the glass, the dark, unreadable eyes staring back at him did not belong to a victor. They belonged to a man who had just realized that holding onto a blade to punish someone else inevitably meant cutting his own hands to the bone. The piece of neon pink paper felt heavier than the industrial carpet extractor. Final notice of eviction. 72 hours to vacate. Zara sat on the edge of her unmade mattress in the Pilsen studio, staring at the bold, unforgiving print. Her banking app remained frozen on the screen of her cracked smartphone, $42.16. Tyler's aggressive defense attorneys, in the subsequent civil lawsuits, had bled her dry, leaving nothing but a ruined credit score and a tarnished name that made securing a standard lease impossible. She had no safety net. Her parents had quietly changed their phone numbers the week her face was splashed across the Chicago Tribune alongside Tyler's embezzlement scandal. She had to survive. At 7 a.m. when the night shift officially concluded, Zara did not go to the subterranean locker rooms. Instead, she smoothed the wrinkles of her gray uniform, tied her hair back tighter, and walked toward the administrative wing on the ground floor. The air here smelled of expensive citrus room spray and freshly brewed artisanal coffee. It was a world she used to belong to. She knocked on the frosted glass door of Phil Gardner's office. "Come in," a gruff voice answered. Phil was hunched over his computer, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. When he saw Zara standing in the doorway, her shoulders rigid, his brow furrowed. "Ahmed, shift's over. Was there an issue on the third floor?" "No, Mr. Gardner," Zara said. Her voice trembled a pathetic flutter that she hated herself for. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands to steady it. I need to ask for a favor. A procedural exception." Phil leaned back in his ergonomic chair, crossing his arms. "We don't do exceptions. I need an advance on my next 2 paychecks." She forced the words out, each syllable tasting like ash. "Just $1,200. I can work double shifts. I can take the weekend deep cleans. But if I don't have the cash by tomorrow, I'll be locked out of my apartment." Phil stared at her. For a terrifying moment, Zara thought he was going to laugh. Instead, he sighed, turning back to his keyboard. "Policy dictates that any wage advance over $500 requires direct approval from the executive suite. I'll submit the request, Ahmed. But don't pack your bags expecting a miracle. The owner is not known for his charity." 40 stories above the morning sun was spilling across Vikram's mahogany desk. He was halfway through his second espresso when a notification chimed on his encrypted tablet. "Subject urgent wage advance request, employee 8842, Ahmed Zaititz." Vikram tapped the screen. The digital form detailed the request $1,200. He stared at the number. It was a cruel, absurd metric of how far she had fallen. $1,200 was the exact price of the vintage Bordeaux she used to casually open on a Tuesday evening when she felt bored. Now it was the barrier between her and the streets of Chicago. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking softly in the quiet penthouse. He held her survival at the tip of his index finger. A single tap on the red deny icon, and she would be cast out into the cold, effectively destroyed. It was the absolute total victory he had craved 5 years ago. Yet his finger hovered over the screen, paralyzed. If she was evicted, she would leave. She would disappear into the underbelly of the city, vanishing from his monitors, from his hallways, from his orbit. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he did not want her to disappear. Her presence in his hotel was a toxic bleeding wound, but it was his wound. Slowly, deliberately, Vikram pressed the green approve icon. He wasn't saving her. He was buying her. He was ensuring that the ghost remained trapped in his labyrinth, completely unaware of the invisible chains he was tightening around her wrists. The $1,200 hit Zara's bank account on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She immediately wired the funds to her landlord, watching the balance drop back down to a desolate 2 digits. The red eviction notice was torn into pieces and thrown into the trash bin. She had bought herself 30 days of breathing room. She was standing at the bus stop on Halsted Street, the icy Chicago drizzle soaking through the thin fabric of her coat, when her phone vibrated against her ribs. The screen displayed an unsaved out-of-state number. Assuming it was a debt collector, a frequent occurrence since the bankruptcy, Zara swiped to answer, prepared to recite her standard script of having no seizable assets. She pressed the cold glass to her ear. "I have to admit, Z, the gray uniform isn't exactly your color. I miss the silk." The world simply stopped. The ambient noise of the city, the hiss of the bus tires on the wet asphalt, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of pedestrians was sucked into a vacuum. Zara's lungs seized. It was a voice she had spent the last 2 years trying to scrub from her brain. It was the voice that used to whisper promises of empires and luxury suites, the same voice that had later screamed obscenities at her when the federal agents kicked down their door. "Tyler, how did you get this number?" Zara whispered, her vocal cords tight and scraping. "Where are you?" "Close enough to know you're working the graveyard shift at the Grand Elysium," Tyler said. The signature charm was still there, but the edges were frayed, laced with a manic desperation. "A bit of a step down from the country club, isn't it? Listen, Z, my lawyers are bleeding me. The frozen assets aren't thawing. I need 10 grand. A harsh, hysterical laugh tore out of Zara's throat before she could stop it. 10 grand, Tyler. I scrubbed toilets for $16 an hour. I just had to beg for an advance to avoid sleeping on the street. I have nothing. You made sure of that. You work at a billionaire's playground." Tyler's voice dropped, the velvet stripping away to reveal the cold steel underneath. "Steal it. Borrow it. I don't care. If I don't have the cash by Monday, I'm going to make a very concerning phone call to the general manager of the Elysium. I'll send them the sealed depositions. I'll tell them you helped me hide the offshore accounts. You think a place like that wants a convicted fraudster's mistress handling keys to their penthouse suites? You'll be fired before your next shift." The phone line went dead. Zara lowered the phone slowly. Her vision blurred, the edges of the streetlights bleeding into sharp, painful halos. The panic attack did not build. It hit her with the concussive force of a freight train. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird battering a cage. She stumbled backward, her spine hitting the glass of the bus shelter. She couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, smelling of wet concrete and the phantom scent of Tyler's expensive vetiver cologne. She slid down the glass until she hit the wet pavement, burying her face in her hands. She had burned down a beautiful, peaceful marriage for a man who was now threatening to destroy the miserable scraps she had left. She was trapped. She had bound herself to the hotel with the wage advance, and now Tyler was threatening to sever the only rope keeping her from drowning. Trembling in the cold rain, Zara realized the most terrifying truth of all: the past was not a ghost you could leave behind. It was a shadow, and it only grew longer the further you tried to run. The corporate servers of the Grand Elysium were protected by a sophisticated firewall programmed by Vikram himself to flag specific keywords sent to any administrative inbox. At 9:14 a.m. on Monday, an email addressed to the general manager was automatically intercepted and rerouted directly to the penthouse. The subject line read, "Background check anomaly. Employee Zara Ahmed." Vikram sat at his desk, his coffee turning cold as he stared at the attached PDF files. They were redacted court transcripts, banking anomalies, and a thinly veiled extortion note demanding a quiet financial settlement to prevent a public scandal. Tyler Black had actually followed through. A cold, sterile anger crystallized in Vikram's chest. He did not feel the fiery protective urge of a husband rushing to defend the woman he loved. That man had died 5 years ago. What Vikram felt now was the territorial rage of a king watching a diseased rat attempt to crawl over the walls of his fortress. Tyler Black, a man whose unchecked greed had left a trail of destruction, was now trying to drag his filth into the Elysium, into Vikram's sanctuary. Vikram picked up his private phone and dialed a direct line to the senior partner of the corporate law firm, kept on heavy retainer by the hotel group. "Mr. Patel," a smooth voice answered. "There is a man named Tyler Black operating on the fringes of Chicago," Vikram said, his tone flat and clinical. "He just attempted to extort my enterprise, find his current creditors, buy his outstanding debts through one of our holding companies, and then call them all in immediately. Pin him to the wall. Make it unequivocally clear that if he ever contacts anyone associated with this hotel again, he will be dealing with federal prosecutors. Excise him." "Understood, sir. The machinery will be in motion by noon." The line clicked dead. Vikram deleted the email from the secure server, erasing it from existence. The threat was neutralized, buried in the dark without a single raised voice. Down in the subterranean locker rooms, Monday night arrived with the suffocating weight of an impending execution. Zara punched in her time card at 11 p.m. Her hands shaking so badly she dropped the plastic slip twice. She braced herself for Phil Gardner's voice over the intercom, summoning her to the office to strip her of her uniform and demand the advance back. She waited for the security guards to escort her out the service doors. Midnight passed, then 2 a.m. Zara pushed her cart through the silent, dimly lit hallways of the 4th floor. The air was perfectly still. The staff radios remained strictly operational. When she crossed paths with Phil near the linen chutes, he merely stepped aside, marked a box on his clipboard, and kept walking. His demeanor was completely unchanged. The bomb had not detonated. Instead of relief, a creeping, icy dread began to coil in Zara's stomach. Tyler was a desperate, cornered man. He did not make empty threats, especially when it came to his own survival. He should have called the manager. He should have burned her fragile new world down to the foundation. The fact that the hotel remained entirely undisturbed meant something or someone had silenced him. She paused in front of a gilded mirror at the end of the corridor, staring at her own pale reflection. The impossible wage advance she shouldn't have been approved for. The chilling hallway encounter. The sudden absolute disappearance of Tyler's threat. The pieces began to shift, aligning into a terrifying picture. She was no longer just a nameless face hiding in the basement of a random luxury hotel. Someone was actively manipulating the shadows around her. And as she looked at the meticulously maintained perfection of the Elysium, she began to suspect exactly whose empire she was trapped inside. The master maintenance key card was only meant to be used for emergency flood extractions. At 6:45 a.m., as the rest of the night crew filtered down to the locker rooms, Zara swiped it against the scanner of the executive service elevator. The light blinked green. The steel box surged upward, carrying her to the 40th floor. Her heart hammered a violent, erratic rhythm against her ribs. The crippling fear of the past few days had burned away, leaving behind a sharp, terrifying clarity. Tyler's sudden silence, the impossible wage advance, the absolute invisibility she was afforded by management, it wasn't luck. It was architecture. The elevator doors parted to reveal a hushed, sprawling reception area bathed in the pale light of dawn. Zara bypassed the empty assistant's desk, her heavy work boots sinking into the plush custom-loomed carpet. She stopped in front of the massive double doors of the inner office. She didn't knock, she pushed them open. Vikram was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, buttoning the cuffs of a crisp white shirt. He froze. For a long moment, the only sound in the cavernous office was the soft hum of the climate control. Zara stood in the doorway, still wearing her shapeless gray uniform, the faint smell of industrial bleach clinging to her skin. She was an anomaly in his perfect, multi-million-dollar sanctuary. "Did you buy his debt?" Zara's voice was a ragged whisper, but it carried across the room like a gunshot. Vikram did not flinch. He slowly lowered his hands, turning to face her completely. His face was a mask of cold sculpted marble. "You are trespassing in a restricted area, Zara. Return your key card to Phil and clock out." "Don't." She stepped further into the room, the heavy doors clicking shut behind her. The physical distance between them was vast, but the emotional collision was immediate. "Don't treat me like an employee right now. You approved the advance. You silenced Tyler. You stood in that hallway and looked right through me. Was this the plan? Did you see my name on the application and decide it would be a fun, sick game to watch your ex-wife scrub the floors of your empire?" "I didn't bring you here." Vikram's voice dropped, the chilling calm fracturing to reveal a dark, terrifying intensity underneath. He took a slow step toward his desk. "Your own disastrous choices brought you to my basement. You sought shelter in my hotel because you ruined your own life. I simply chose not to throw you out." "Then why keep me?" She fired back, tears of exhaustion and humiliation finally spilling over her lashes. "Why give me the money if you hate me this much, Vikram? Why not just let me drown? Why play God with my life?" "Because you owed me a death," Vikram shouted. The sudden explosion of volume shattered the pristine quiet of the penthouse. He slammed his palms flat against the mahogany desk, leaning him forward. The veins in his neck were taut. 5 years of buried, festering agony finally ripped through his chest. "You owed me a death, Zara. You murdered our life on a Tuesday afternoon for a con artist in a cheap suit, and you expected me to just bleed out quietly in the suburbs. You didn't even have the decency to leave before you brought him into our bed." Zara flinched violently as if he had struck her. She wrapped her arms around her own stomach, bending slightly beneath the crushing weight of his words. "I wanted to watch you hit the bottom, hi," Vikram continued, his voice dropping back to a lethal, trembling whisper. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them until they were only a few feet apart. "I wanted to look at the monitors and see that the spectacular life you threw me away for had turned to ash. I wanted to see you broken. And are you satisfied? Zara looked up at him, her face with her defenses completely stripped away. She laid her soul bare, offering him the wreckage he had asked for. Look at me, Vic. I have nothing. I am nothing. You won. Is it enough to fix you? Vikram stared down at the woman he had loved more than his own life. He saw the genuine, absolute devastation in her eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the ghosts of their past. He slowly clenched his hands into fists at his sides, realizing with a sickening, hollow despair that watching her bleed had not healed him at all. The echo of Vikram's shout seemed to settle into the very fabric of the custom wool carpet. I wanted to see you broken. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and jagged. Zara didn't move. The tears had stopped falling, leaving a chilling, absolute stillness in her chest. For 2 years, she had silently blamed Tyler's manipulation, the relentless federal prosecutors, the bankruptcy, and the harshness of the city for her downfall. She had clung to a desperate, hidden narrative that she was simply a casualty of a grand disaster. But standing in front of the man whose soul she had mutilated, the final layer of her self-deception peeled away. She looked at the expensive tailored lines of Vikram's shirt, the staggering luxury of the penthouse, and then down at her own bleach-stained uniform. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was the sole architect of her own ruin. You did see me broken, Vic, Zara whispered. Her voice held no anger, no defense, only a hollow, echoing truth. You've seen it every night on your monitors. But it wasn't the bankruptcy or the eviction that broke me. She looked directly into his eyes, stripping away the last ounce of her pride. It was the moment I walked into our empty house and realized exactly what I had traded you for. A cheap, empty thrill. She took a slow, trembling breath. I am sorry. Not because I'm scrubbing your floors and not because I'm terrified of Tyler. I am sorry because I took a good, kind man and forced him to carry a darkness he never deserved. You are entirely right to leave. Vikram stood frozen behind the mahogany desk. He had spent half a decade, thousands of hours fantasizing about this exact moment, the moment she would stand before him completely defeated, offering no excuses, taking full accountability for the massacre of their marriage. It was supposed to be the crescendo of his victory. It was the closure he had paid in blood to achieve. Instead, a wave of profound, sickening nausea washed over him. He turned his head, his gaze drawn to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The dawn had broken over Chicago, casting a harsh, pale light across the glass. In the reflection, he saw his own face superimposed over the skyline. The man staring back at him was powerful, wealthy, and utterly unrecognizable. He had weaponized his empire, his influence, and his own lingering grief just to orchestrate the psychological torture of a woman who was already drowning. He had built a labyrinth just to watch her bleed. He hadn't just survived the betrayal. He had allowed it to rot his core, turning him into a cruel, vindictive shadow of the man he used to be. Zara, Vikram's voice cracked, the single syllable tearing through the quiet room. She paused with her hand on the heavy brass door handle, but she did not turn around. Her posture was completely defeated, yet strangely resolute. You don't have to play God from the dark anymore, she said softly, her forehead resting briefly against the polished wood of the door. I understand the price now. I've paid it, and I won't let you turn yourself into a monster just to keep punishing me. The heavy door clicked open, then shut with a soft, definitive thud. The sound reverberated through the penthouse, leaving Vikram entirely alone in his sanctuary. He looked around the immaculate, silent office, realizing that the billion-dollar empire he had built was nothing more than a spectacular, empty mausoleum. The subterranean locker room of the Grand Elysium was a concrete bunker, smelling faintly of damp boots and cheap aerosol deodorant. Zara stood in front of locker number 42. She didn't have much to take. A frayed wool scarf, a pair of worn sneakers, and the plastic name tag that read Ahmed. She tossed the name tag into the metal trash bin. It hit the bottom with a hollow, definitive rattle. She shoved her arms into her coat and turned toward the long, fluorescent-lit corridor leading to the loading docks. Vikram was standing at the end of the hall. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. The top buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, and his sleeves were pushed up to his forearms. Stripped of the imposing armor of the penthouse, he looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were stark under the harsh industrial lights. Zara stopped. She didn't shrink back, nor did she attempt to bypass him. She simply waited, the heavy silence of the basement wrapping around them. You asked me once in your head why I didn't fight, Vikram said. His voice was no longer a weapon. It was quiet, steady, and incredibly heavy. The acoustic tile of the ceiling absorbed the sound, making the space feel terrifyingly intimate. Why I didn't break the china or scream at you or demand to know why I wasn't enough. Zara gripped the edge of her coat. Her knuckles turned white, but she kept her gaze locked on his. I saw the doorbell footage at 3 in the afternoon. Vikram continued, taking a slow, measured step forward. I sat in my office at the firm, and I watched the man I loved most in the world pull another man into our home. My chest felt like it was caving in. I drove back to the suburbs, entirely prepared to burn the house down. He stopped a few feet away from her. The chill of the Chicago morning was seeping under the heavy steel doors of the loading dock, biting at their ankles. But when I walked into the kitchen and saw your wine glass on the counter, I stopped. Vikram said, his dark eyes searching hers for the final time. Because I realized something profoundly pathetic. If I had to scream to remind you of my worth, if I had to violently rip you away from Tyler Black to prove that our marriage mattered, then you were already completely gone. My love was absolute, Zara. It was never a negotiation. The moment you let him in, you proved you couldn't afford what I was giving you. So I left the ring and I walked away. I didn't ghost you to punish you. I ghosted you because I owed myself the respect of not begging for a woman who had already sold us out. The words were not delivered with malice. They were a surgical incision, clean and absolute. Zara absorbed the blow without flinching. The truth of it settled deep in her bones, extinguishing the last tiny delusional ember of hope she hadn't realized she was still harboring. He hadn't run away from the pain. He had simply recognized his own value and refused to compromise it. I know, Zara whispered, her voice rough but entirely steady. There were no tears left to blur her vision. I was bankrupt long before Tyler ever lost his money, Vic. You gave me everything and I threw it away because I was hollow inside. You were right not to fight for me. I wasn't worth the casualties. She didn't offer a plea for forgiveness. She didn't ask for a second chance. She didn't offer him the one thing she owed him 5 years ago, complete, unvarnished accountability. Vikram exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry half a decade of compressed grief out of his lungs. The suffocating pressure in his chest, the phantom weight he had carried since that Tuesday afternoon, finally began to lift. He looked at the woman he used to call his wife, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't see a ghost. He just saw a broken woman standing in the cold. At 8:15 a.m., the encrypted phone on Vikram's desk vibrated a single time. The text message from his lead corporate counsel contained only 3 sentences. Black signed the non-disclosure agreements at 8 a.m. under threat of federal wire fraud submission. Patel Holdings now legally owns the entirety of his outstanding debt portfolios. He is boarding a one-way flight to Anchorage, Alaska. The matter is permanently closed. Vikram set the phone down on the leather blotter. There was no surge of adrenaline, no triumphant rush of dopamine. The absolute financial and legal annihilation of Tyler Black, the man who had detonated his marriage, felt remarkably hollow. It was simply the surgical removal of a parasite. The chaos Tyler had brought into their lives was finally legally and physically excised from Chicago. 40 stories below, Zara was standing in the administrative wing. The morning shift had already taken over the corridors, buzzing with the quiet, efficient energy of the day staff. She did not go to the basement locker room. Instead, she stood before Phil Gardner's desk. She placed the heavy brass master keycard on the glass surface, followed by her plastic employee badge. Phil paused his typing, looking up with a frown. Your shift ended an hour ago, Ahmed. What is this? I'm resigning, Mr. Gardner, Zara said, her voice calm and remarkably steady. Effective immediately. Phil stared at the badge, then back at her. You begged for a wage advance 4 days ago to avoid eviction. If you walk out now without fulfilling the labor contract, Human Resources will classify it as job abandonment. The remaining balance of the advance will be sent to a collection agency. You'll ruin whatever is left of your credit. I understand, Zara replied. She didn't offer an explanation, nor did she flinch at the threat of collections. The fear of financial ruin, which had paralyzed her for 2 years, had miraculously evaporated. Staying in the Elysium meant staying tethered to Vikram's lingering grief and her own suffocating guilt. It meant living as a ghost in the basement of her ex-husband's empire. She would rather freeze on the streets of Pilsen than spend another night trapped in that emotional purgatory. Mail my final check to the address on file, she said softly, turning away before Phil could utter another word. Zara walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the employee exit. Pushing open the heavy steel fire doors, she stepped out into the loading dock alleyway. The crisp, biting chill of the Chicago morning hit her lungs like a physical blow. The air smelled of diesel exhaust from a parked delivery truck and the damp metallic tang of the nearby river. She pulled her frayed wool scarf tighter around her neck and began to walk. The roar of the L train passing overhead drowned out the ambient noise of the city. With every step she took away from the towering glass and steel monolith of the Grand Elysium, the invisible suffocating weight that had crushed her chest for half a decade began to lift. She was broke. She was entirely alone. But for the first time since the day the federal agents knocked on Tyler's door, she was breathing on her own. Up in the penthouse, Vikram stood before the bank of security monitors. Screen 4 showed the alleyway camera. He watched the small, solitary figure in the gray coat walking down the concrete ramp, her head bowed against the wind. He watched her step out onto the busy pavement of Halsted Street, merging into the morning crowd until the sea of pedestrians swallowed her completely. Vikram reached out and pressed the power button on the monitor. The screen went black, leaving only his own reflection in the dark glass. He did not go after her. He simply turned his back to the screens, walking toward his desk, to begin the day, finally leaving the ghosts in the dark where they belonged. October arrived in Chicago with a sharp, biting wind that swept off Lake Michigan, stripping the elm trees along the avenues of their autumn gold. The city moved with a frantic, shivering energy, a sea of dark wool coats and hurried footsteps bracing against the impending winter. Zara Ahmed walked down the pavement of State Street, her hands wrapped tightly around a cardboard cup of black coffee. She was not wearing a shapeless gray uniform, nor was she draped in the imported silk of her past. She wore a simple second-hand camel coat and a thick maroon scarf. The crushing weight of the bankruptcy and the suffocating shadows of the Grand Elysium were behind her. She had secured a quiet, unremarkable job, as an administrative assistant at a small dental clinic in Rogers Park. The pay was barely enough to cover the rent of her new cramped one-bedroom apartment, but it was honest. More importantly, it was entirely hers. She slept through the nights now, the phantom scent of Tyler's cologne, and the echoing silence of Vikram's absence finally faded into dull, manageable aches. 3 blocks away, walking in the opposite direction, Vikram Patel buttoned the collar of his charcoal overcoat. He had left the fortified sanctuary of his penthouse office for a lunch meeting, a rarity just a few months prior. The bank of security monitors in his office had been relocated to the basement security hub. He no longer spent his nights staring at the grainy footage of the second-floor concourse, searching for ghosts in the dark. The sprawling empire of the Elysium remained, but it was no longer a mausoleum built to house his grief. They reached the intersection of State and Lake, just as the pedestrian light flickered to a glowing white walk symbol. The lunch hour crowd surged forward from both sides of the crosswalk. It was a chaotic symphony of rattling L trains, overhead blaring taxi horns, and the low hum of 100 simultaneous conversations. In the exact center of the intersection, the dense crowd momentarily parted. Zara looked up from her coffee cup. Vikram glanced away from the towering reflection of the skyline in a nearby glass facade. Their eyes met. The physical distance between them was less than 4 feet. There was no freezing paralysis, no sudden violent dropping of the stomach. The chaotic noise of the city did not fade away into a cinematic vacuum. The world kept spinning relentlessly around them. Vikram's face was unreadable, but the chilling, abyssal void that had terrified her in the service corridor was gone. The hard lines around his jaw had softened, leaving behind the quiet weariness of a man who had finally laid down a terribly heavy sword. Zara did not shrink back. She did not lower her gaze in shame, nor did she attempt to project a false sense of pride. She simply looked at the man who had once been her entire world, offering him the calm, unvarnished truth of the woman she had become, broken, rebuilt, and finally accountable. Neither of them slowed their pace. There was no space for words. The time for shouting, pleading, and explaining had died 5 years ago on a pristine kitchen island. As they closed the final gap, passing shoulder to shoulder in the middle of the street, Vikram gave a single microscopic dip of his chin. It was a fleeting, silent nod, an acknowledgement of the profound love they had shared, the catastrophic devastation they had caused, and the absolute finality of their severance. Zara returned the nod, a fragile, sad smile barely touching the corners of her mouth before it disappeared into the folds of her scarf. And then they passed each other. Vikram stepped up onto the opposite curb, merging seamlessly into the northbound crowd. Zara continued south, taking a slow sip of her coffee. The bitter, warm liquid grounded her in the present. They walked away without looking back, disappearing into the endless, shifting fabric of the city, carrying their scars with quiet dignity into separate, irrevocably changed lives.